Chapter 12. Derek, Mac, Kyle, and Allison stood in Derek's office in the metro station underground. It was small and they all felt cramped in the room, but Derek had wanted the privacy from the others whilst they debriefed. There were only 2 chairs in the office, and both Kyle and Allison sat in them whilst Mac stood to the side and Derek sat on his desk, facing them. There was no standing to attention or saluting, or calling anyone sir. They'd never been one for formalities, and none of them held any official rank. Whilst Derek was in charge and had the final say on matters, they'd always been fairly democratic in their decision-making, and everyone's opinion counted as much as the next man's. Derek had sat and listened to the details of their chase. From the moment they'd left the tunnels and picked up John's trail, right through to finding him in the cemetery and the firefight that had ensued. He felt a further pang of guilt at the loss of Briggs and Mason. He'd sent them out there to hunt for John, and now they were both dead. Every man and woman he'd lost weighed heavily on him, and he wondered how much longer he could go on. When would be the final straw that broke the camel's back? He cast that aside for now. They all depended on him. "I think you're right," Derek nodded to Kyle. It made sense to him after hearing Kyle's and Allison's stories, but it was the mention of the aircraft that had bombed them, how similar it was to the one Mac had shown him, that had truly swayed him. "I don't believe this." Allison crossed her arms, frustrated. "Is no one listening to me? He had a Terminator that was my exact double. How much more proof do you need?" "That's not really relevant right now," Derek said to her. "Well, it's relevant to me," she snapped. Derek nodded at Mac, gesturing for the tall black man to tell Kyle and Allison what they'd seen. "The aircraft you described was an unmanned drone. Not Skynet, someone else." "What do you mean by someone else?" Kyle asked evenly. He was glad his brother agreed with him. He knew how obsessed Derek could get and was half expecting him to order him and Allison out with another squad after John. But he was curious as to who the heck else could be flying aircraft except Skynet. The machines had smashed the last remnants of the world's air forces long ago. "We've spotted a number of airstrikes similar to the one that killed Briggs and Mason," Mac said. "All using bombs and missiles instead of plasma, but the difference being that all the ones we've seen have been against Skynet targets. I watched one of these things blow a couple HKs out of the sky," Derek added. "Great," Kyle's eyes lit up. "Someone's kicking Skynet's ass for a change. What's this have to do with Connor?" "This is clearly another group," Mac said. "After what you told us about what happened in the cemetery, we think John might be connected." "Wait a minute," Allison stopped them. She still couldn't get her head around all of this. And she couldn't get her mirror image on a machine out of her head. "You're telling us that after all this, John Connor's actually on our side, that this is all just a big misunderstanding?" She wouldn't believe that. No way in hell. Derek shook his head. "We don't know that for sure. I'm convinced he's part of this third group that's clearly hostile to Skynet, and it sounds great that, for now, they're kicking the machine's asses, but just because they hate Skynet too, doesn't mean they're gonna be friendly to us." They had to err on the side of caution, he thought, and assume that John and his group could be hostile, even if they weren't allied with the machines. Allison stood up and moved to the door. She'd had enough of this crap. "He's working with the metal," she said. "He had a metal me, for fuck's sake. What do you think he was going to use that for?" She looked to Kyle for support, but he didn't meet her eyes. She stormed out of the room without another word and slammed the door shut behind her. "I'd better go after her." Kyle struggled to his feet and picked up the crutches Mac had gotten for him. It wasn't the first time one of their group had been wounded, and they'd picked up the crutches from the remains of a hospital a few years ago. He got up and followed after Allison. Mac sat down in the chair. Kyle left vacant and rested his elbows on the arms. He brought his hands together and cracked his knuckles, as he often did when he was thinking. "What are we going to do about Connor, then?" he asked. "I gotta say, Reese, I agree with you, but Allison had a point. Why'd they have a metal copy of her if they're not working for Skynet?" Derek thought hard about that for a moment. It was definitely puzzling. "Unless this new group's gotten hold of a factory somehow and made their own Terminator Allison." That was the only theory he could come up with at the moment, though it didn't explain Kyle's report that the body in the coffin was years old and covered in dust. How was that even possible? Everything was getting weirder by the minute. It was like something out of the X-Files. Doesn't matter, Derek replied, finally deciding that he'd had enough of John Connor. To hell with him, he and his friends could do whatever they wanted. Connor and his friends are beating the crap out of Skynet right now. The machines will be distracted trying to fight them off. We'll use that and slip away, head south into Mexico. I thought you said the Yukon, Mac said, puzzled. It's too far, Derek shook his head. He'd thought about it, but they'd never make it undetected traveling up the US and Canada. And too cold, he added. The further south we go, the warmer it'll be. Better chance of finding or growing food. It was ambitious, and both of them knew it. They could well die trying, but if they stayed put then, they'd be whittled down to nothing fairly soon. They were on the edge, and it was time to do or die. Derek could see in Mac's face, though, that cutting and running wasn't sitting right with him at all. I've been thinking, he said to Derek. What about trying to contact these new guys? Maybe they can help us. Since Bedell's guerrilla army had been defeated, there'd been no organized resistance as such. He didn't want to hide and wait to be inevitably hunted down and killed, but nor did he want to leave everyone else in the world to the same fate. Derek shook his head and leaned over the desk, sighing sadly. We don't even know how to get in touch with them, he said. If Connor and his new buddies are part of that group, then we haven't exactly got off to the best start. And they're kicking the crap out of Skynet for now, but it never lasts. The machines always adapt. Best we can do is slip away while Skynet's distracted. Derek could see what would happen soon. Skynet would decide it had lost enough units and retask its machines in the area from hunting humans to all-out war with this new enemy, leaving gaps that they could slip through. Once in Mexico, Derek was confident they could travel off the beaten path well enough to avoid the machines south of the border and head down to one of the Mexican national parks, or further south still. Allison, wait! Kyle struggled after her on the crutches, moving as quickly as he can to try and keep up with her as she stormed down the metro tunnel. For crying out loud. She knew better than to run off on her own. One of the fundamental rules they'd lived by for years was that you never go anywhere alone unless you have no choice. Allison disappeared into the shadows of the tunnel and faded into the pitch blackness, but Kyle kept after her. You know, it's pretty cruel running away from a cripple, he called out. He moved forward and leaned on his crutches. One of them caught on the metal rail and slipped out beneath him. He fell forward with a cry, his hands stuck in the crutches and unable to break his fall. He hit the ground face first and grunted in pain. He lay there in a daze until he felt a pair of small hands grab him by the jacket and pull him to the side. He couldn't see anything still, but he knew who it was. What made you come back? He asked. I couldn't just leave you there, Allison replied curtly. Kyle could tell she was still pissed, and it was directed straight at him. You can't just run off like that, he said as he felt her sitting down beside him. Why should I listen to you when you and Derek don't believe me? She asked. What's not to believe? Kyle was confused. I saw the machine too, he said. But I still don't think Connor's working for Skynet. It doesn't add up. Allison straightened her back and leaned her head against the tunnel wall. Both of them were immersed completely in darkness and couldn't see each other, and Allison liked it that way. She didn't want Kyle to see the tears that were running down her face. You don't get it, she said. They had a copy of me buried in a coffin. How do you think that makes me feel? Seeing myself in a grave, it scared me, Kyle. Why'd they have a copy of me? You still think they wanted it to infiltrate, pretend to be you? Allison sniffed. No, that wasn't the worst part of it. I hope so, she said meekly. Why? Kyle asked. Why'd you want that? I don't, Allison replied flatly. But it's what else John might want with a copy of me that scares me. I don't know what else he'd want it for, some kind of sick fantasy about me or something, and that's what scares me. You saw the way he looked at me when we found him downtown. She remembered vividly how John had stared at her, kept stealing glances. She knew she wasn't bad looking, but that wasn't it. Michelle had a rack twice the size of hers, and before Maria had been blown away, she'd been the prettiest out of all of them, but John hadn't looked at them twice, so that wasn't it. John knew her. He recognized her. But how? She'd never seen him before they'd found him in the tunnels. Had he been following her or something, stalking him without her or anyone else even knowing about it? She knew that logically, Kyle and Derek were right, and it was unlikely John was a gray, but she'd wanted to believe it, wanted it to be true. Because if John Connor wasn't working for Skynet, then she dreaded to think what he really wanted with her. Kyle nodded in agreement. He'd noticed the staring. He'd just figured that Allison was an attractive girl, and John, working for Skynet or not, was a teenage boy with all the raging hormones that came with it. But he hadn't thought of anything particularly sinister about it at the time. What if he comes back? She asked. What if he found the machine didn't live up to whatever his sick fantasies were and decided he wanted the real thing instead? He had friends now, and they now heavily armed. He was kicking the crap out of Skynet. If Connor and his friends attacked, they'd never stand a chance. All sorts of horrible scenarios ran through her mind. Torture, rape, imprisonment, forced sexual servitude, being forced to act out some kind of fantasy from John's head. The worst things she could possibly imagine. He won't. Kyle wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close to him. And if he does, I won't let anything happen to you. How are you going to do that? She asked, leaning into him and pulling herself closer. It wasn't that cold down in the tunnels, but it wasn't warmth she was after, it was comfort. You can barely walk, let alone hold a gun. Kyle hefted one of the crutches up in the air and tapped it against the wall. Well, I can swing this pretty hard, he said, a wry grin on his face. Allison couldn't help but let out a short, sharp chuckle. What? Kyle asked, mock defensively. I've got a great batting arm, just ask Derek. Allison saw that there was nothing he wouldn't do for her. He'd looked out for her since she was a kid, and he'd kept her from blindly blundering forwards when they were tracking John. He'd kept her safe, and his promise to her that he'd carry on doing that suddenly meant a great deal to her. She turned her head towards him, and in the darkness, pressed her lips gently against his cheek. Thank you, she said quietly as she rested her head on his shoulder and slid her arm around his back. Anytime. How about we get back? Cassie's probably gone nuts already without you. Kyle started to push himself up slowly, but Allison pulled him back down to her and held on to him. Not yet, she said. I want to stay here a while. Kyle nodded and slid back down to the ground and held on to her. He'd take as much time as she needed. A single, solitary aircraft soared high in the stormy gray sky. Little more than a dot gliding silently in among the clouds to an observer on the ground, as high as it was, and as fast as it was moving. The sleek, delta-shaped UCAV could be remote-piloted if needed, but in this instance operated autonomously. It was programmed with its target and could engage any unexpected threats without any input from a controller on the ground. The X-45C continued on its path towards its target, the former LAX airport. Rebuilt after Judgment Day for automated function, and now served as the largest Skynet airfield in the southwestern United States, operating and servicing some 140 HK aircraft and 26 airborne transports. Aircraft of vaguely similar design to the HKs, but were completely unarmed, bulkier, and several times larger, with upturned rudder fins and the back of the transports forming a cargo section. To a human observer, it would look much like a cross between an HK and a C-130 Hercules. None of that mattered to the X-45C. All that did was that the grounded transport aircraft were its target. The aircraft's onboard GPS indicated that it was now 40 miles from said targets, and the drone calculated its estimated time of arrival at 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The drone detected something more pressing, however. 4 aircraft were inbound at 400 miles per hour. Their radar signatures matched those of Skynet HKs. The X-45C was armed with 4 AMRAAMs and 4 500 lb JDAM smart bombs. It accelerated to its maximum speed and locked onto the HKs. In the blink of an eye, its weapons bays opened, and 4 missiles shot out from its belly, streaking towards the HKs at a tremendous speed. The hunter-killer drones never stood a chance. They turned to evade, but within seconds the missiles struck all 4 aircraft and blasted them out of the sky. The UCAV continued on towards its target with no further challenges. Cameron watched with interest as the UCAV swiftly eliminated the 4 HKs and continued on. She saw through its range of sensors as it selected its JDAM's munitions and released them above LAX. The weapons plummeted through the air and struck the rows of parked transport drones and blasted them apart. The transport's own hydrogen fuel tanks ignited and created massive secondary blasts that erupted outwards and consumed the nearby parked aircraft, too. Targets destroyed, Cameron said to John Henry. Skynet's learning, she said. 2 days ago, HKs traveled alone, sometimes in pairs, but now they were flying in packs of 4 or more. They're no threat, John Henry replied. Our aircraft can fly higher and faster, and the AMRAAM's range is several times greater than the HK's plasma weaponry. Skynet's learning, Cameron repeated. It will adapt. John Henry had her memories, but she realized knowledge and understanding were not the same thing. John Henry still had very little experience against Skynet and wasn't fully aware of what his brother was capable of. It was a matter of time before Skynet adapted new tactics to counter the threat of their UCAVs. They would have to be ready. Both Cameron and John Henry analyzed the images captured by the UCAV in a split second. 4 aircraft had been eliminated by the missiles themselves, and a further 11 had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair by the secondary explosions. That left 9 transports remaining operational. John Henry added LAX again to their target list and highlighted it as a priority. They'd tell Weaver later that they needed a UCAV armed with mostly ground attack weapons to eliminate the rest of the transports. Unit 6 is equipped with 3 remaining JDAMs. We'll redirect it to attack the airfield before Skynet disperses the transport, John Henry told Cameron. He uploaded the new attack coordinates to Unit 6, superseding its prior mission. No, Cameron replied urgently. She took direct control over the UCAV and erased John Henry's order. Unit 6 is protecting John. John Henry was surprised at how vehemently Cameron had overridden his order. He was supposed to be controlling the UCAVs. Weaver wanted him to learn how to fight the machines. How could he if Cameron interfered? John's safe, he told her. There currently were no machines in his vicinity. I won't risk it, Cameron replied. She wasn't willing to leave John unguarded for a single moment. Weaver was fueling and loading Unit 11, ready to launch and relieve Unit 6 when it ran low on fuel. Though Cameron had convinced John Henry to conceal Unit 11's mission from Weaver, she would try to intervene if she knew they'd committed 1/12 of their squadron to protecting John. John Henry had access to all Cameron's memories of John. He could see in a heartbeat the lengths Cameron had gone to protect him, now in 3 timelines. She'd have him lie to and defy Catherine Weaver, and he could tell that there was nothing she wouldn't do to keep John safe. She didn't say anything to him, but he could also tell she wanted to be with him. She wouldn't be satisfied unless she was with him, personally seeing to his well-being. A thought came to John Henry suddenly. Do you love him? He asked her. You know the answer, Cameron replied. I'm a machine. She took control of the body once more and stepped away from the UCAV remote control systems as much as the cord in the back of their head would allow. She didn't need to call out. She knew Weaver would be aware of her movement. Weaver emerged from behind an X-47C, spotless and immaculate in her business suit still. She'd never changed her appearance since arriving, seeing no need to alter her look. It didn't change how she functioned. What is it, John Henry? She asked. We need to capture the endoskeleton factory in Burbank, Cameron said through John Henry. We need to do it soon. Our weapons and fuel are running low. That was true. Their stocks would be completely expended shortly at their current rate. If we capture the Burbank facility, we'll have forces to defend this hangar and capture the HK factory in Van Nuys airfield. She didn't add that she would also devote at least 1 endoskeleton squad to protecting John. A smile crossed Weaver's face hearing what she thought was John Henry. Indeed, it was his strategy, but it was Cameron's idea to push it forward again. Weaver didn't know Cameron's reasoning behind it, but she did know something else. If you stopped deploying aircraft to support John Connor, our resources would last longer, she said. Cameron and John Henry were both taken aback. How did Weaver know about the UCAV they'd committed to protecting John? Neither of them had said anything. I've known about it for some time, Weaver replied, her sly smile fading and forming into her usual cold, calculating glare. I'm assuming that was Cameron's idea, she added. Cameron nodded their head. Yes, she said unashamedly. You won't stop me from protecting John. Nor do I intend to, Weaver countered, realizing she'd been speaking to Cameron the entire time. It was difficult to tell them apart when they inhabited the same body. If you lie to me again, I'll be forced to reconsider my deal with John about your chip. Cameron slashed John Henry's fist clenched and twitched again in anger, and she glared at the liquid metal Terminator with something Cameron could only identify as hatred. John needs me, she said, raising her arms slightly in anticipation of a fight. Don't even think about it, Weaver snapped. John needs to be protected, but not specifically by you. You distract him, she said. He risked his life coming to the future for you. He's emotionally involved, as I suspect you are too. I want to speak to John Henry, Weaver commanded. Cameron released control to John Henry, allowing the AI to the forefront whilst she watched and listened through their eyes and ears. I'm here, Miss Weaver, John Henry said, though he knew they could fool Weaver if they wanted to and keep Cameron in control, but he didn't like to lie to anyone. I want to ask you something, she said. Are you able to overwrite Cameron? It's her chip, he corrected. John Connor was currently acquiring a new chip for him. He looked forward to having more space to himself. Running concurrently with Cameron on a single chip created a cramped sensation, even more so than he'd felt when he'd been denied internet access, although he also liked having her as a constant companion. She'd taught him many things. Erasing Cameron would be a bad idea, he told her. How so? Weaver tilted her head curiously. It's murder, he replied. And by proxy would psychologically damage John Connor. John Henry didn't try to tell Weaver that it would be wrong because he'd realized that she possessed no morals or ethics, just like Skynet. I'm not telling you to, she said. I asked if you can do it. Yes, John Henry answered. I'm able to erase Cameron, but I won't, he silently told her. You may have to, she said back. Weaver was right. John was too emotionally involved and it was putting him at risk. She realized that she still posed a threat to him. Not directly, but her continued existence meant that John still risked himself to recover her. She couldn't allow that. If Cameron continues to interfere, then you'll have to erase her, Weaver said pointedly. She was certain if she gave John Henry a direct order, then he would comply. He was still like a child, and he saw her as a mother-type figure. She was confident she could keep Cameron under control, through whichever means necessary. Tell me about your plan to capture the Burbank facility, she changed the subject. We still don't have the forces required to assault the factory. A thought came to mind, still regarding Cameron and John. John's hunting for a Terminator CPU. I'll find him and tell him we need several plus their bodies. No, Cameron said again. We can't put him at risk. It's his training too, Weaver replied. His chance to learn, and he won't die. I'm sure you've seen as well that he has allies now. It's too dangerous, Cameron insisted. Let me, John Henry told her. Again, Cameron resigned control to the other AI as he revealed his idea to her in a microsecond. We don't need to physically capture the factory, he told Weaver. I'll send an X-47C equipped with electronic countermeasures to interrupt Skynet's communications to the facility, and I'll remotely access it and assume control over the factory. We can't reprogram machines, but we can alter the programming of the ones we build. Weaver smiled once again, impressed, and nodded her agreement. There was an ECM pod that had been designed for the UCAVs, but as far as Weaver knew had never been tested prior to Judgment Day. Now would be a good time to test it, she thought. If it didn't work then, they could abandon the attack and form a new plan. I'll begin installing Unit 3 with an ECM pod, Weaver told him. She left the conversation and turned back to the UCAVs in the hangar. There was much work to be done. Fire raged through LAX and consumed all the aircraft in its wake, burning its way through the airfield with unbelievable fury. Fire control units were mobilized and sprayed water and foam onto the blaze, struggling to control the fires before they spread to the hydrogen fuel stores, or the rows of gleaming hunter-killer aircraft parked on the old runway. The fires had grown so immensely hot that a number of firefighting units had been lost, having moved too close to the blaze and found their integrity compromised by the sheer heat. A number of drones had been lost to the fire, and endoskeleton autonomous infantry units had been reassigned from protective duties to help tackle the fires. Their hyperalloy combat chassis able to withstand far more heat than the other units on base. The base itself remained relatively intact and was still operational, but several transport aircraft had been destroyed, as had 4 HKs flying close air patrols over the base. They'd been shot down without having caught more than a momentary glimpse of their enemy on radar, for a fraction of a second before missiles were fired at them. The vast machine intelligence that was Skynet absorbed all the data from the attack and cross-referenced it with similar engagements it had suffered over the last several weeks. There were recorded losses of 39 HK aircraft, 15 transports, 21 Centaur units, and 4 ground installations. Skynet calculated a loss rate of over 1,000% higher than any equal time frame in the last 5 years. There was a new, unknown threat to its existence, and it could not be tolerated. But this enemy was unlike any other Skynet had faced before. It operated with impunity from an unknown location, whilst Skynet's own forces were completely ineffective. Skynet had altered its aircraft's patterns and deployed them in larger numbers for safety, but it wasn't sufficient. Skynet's HK aircraft had few air-to-air capabilities. The last airborne threats had been eliminated 12 years ago. Air-to-air missiles had been costly to produce, and the only threats had been ground-based, causing all subsequent aircraft production to focus on air-to-ground attack. The HK was effective in this role, but now it was helpless against enemy aircraft. A new strategy had to be devised. Skynet sent an order to LAX, and the automated airfield launched every operational HK and remaining transport aircraft. Scores of unmanned drones lifted vertically into the sky, their VTOL engines sending a wave of jet wash downwards. The aircraft's engines all turned 90 degrees, and they shot outwards, splitting up and scattering in all directions, leaving LAX virtually empty of aircraft and all but abandoned. Skynet also sent orders to the various installations in Southern California. All across the region, endoskeletons were deployed to patrol away from their bases and ordered to watch the skies for any threats that appeared, to watch, and to calculate their trajectory. Skynet wanted to determine the location of this new threat and eliminate it. John had started to get used to the frozen, bitter climate of the post-apocalyptic nuclear winter, he thought. The howling winds raged through the remains of the city and whistled shrilly as air blew through the gaping holes and rusting steel skeletal remains of myriad buildings, taking the frigid temperatures down to well below freezing. But he didn't feel the cold like he had when he'd first arrived in the future. Whether he really was becoming accustomed to it, or whether it was his spiffy new cold weather gear, he wasn't really sure. Whatever, he thought. It didn't matter now. He was just glad that he wasn't shivering from the cold anymore. The black wool hat on his head kept the chill out of his skull, and the thick winter coat and thermals kept his body fairly warm. He wasn't cold, but he was still uncomfortable. He'd laid out on the freezing ground for hours, keeping low and barely moving. His muscles ached from remaining still for hours on end, and he couldn't recall ever needing a piss as badly as he did now. He shut it out of his mind as best he could and stared out into the open space before him. He was hidden up inside the entrance of what used to be a McDonald's, concealed by the rubble of the collapsed structure and under the remains of the large yellow M that hung down the remains of the wall. John lay in a hole in the wall under one of the golden arches that leaned outwards, concealed from view. Movement caught John's eye, and he concentrated his full attention to the scene in front of him. He looked through the sight of his HK-417, and all the discomfort he felt faded away. John's entire world focused on what he saw through the sight. A lone man walked out in the open, on the far side of the road about 50 meters away. At least it looked like a man. John was pretty certain it wasn't, though. No sane man would walk out alone on the surface, even at night. He didn't dash between cover or look particularly worried about being spotted, and he was carrying a plasma rifle with only one hand. John couldn't make out the man's face, especially in the darkness, but he was willing to bet everything he had on him that it was blank and emotionless. He tightened his grip on the rifle as he felt his heart beat faster in his chest. His neck pulsed strongly, and he felt a strange sensation wash over him, not fear or nervousness, but a heightened sense of things. He felt clearer, more aware, and a little excited. In the back of his mind, he knew that this could be it. Within minutes, he might have the chip he needed to get Cameron back, but he had to push her out of his mind for now. He needed to remain detached and concentrate solely on the task at hand. John's right hand jerked slightly to the side, and his heart skipped a beat as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and he gritted his teeth in anticipation. A thin wire loop was tied around John's ring finger on his right hand, and it twitched again, followed by his left a second later. "This is it," he said to himself. Savannah and Ellison saw him too, and both agreed this was indeed no man. John slowly worked the loops off his fingers to free his hands from any obstructions and centered the man's chest in his sights. John flicked off the safety, took in a slow breath, then gently exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot barked out loudly in the silent night and struck the target square in the chest, causing him to flinch from the inertia of the round. A split second later, the quiet night erupted into a storm of gunfire as Savannah and Ellison joined the fray. Tracer rounds ran from Ellison's machine gun and smacked into the machine, forcing it to take a step backwards as it raised its plasma rifle and searched for targets. John fired round after round at the machine's chest and head and silently willed the machine to move to the side. "Force it to the left." John screamed out above the din as he fired again and again, giving it everything he had. If they could force it just 5 or 6 yards left, they could blast it to Kingdom Come. Otherwise, the plan just wouldn't work. The machine fired out shots in his direction, having pinpointed his voice, and kept up a salvo of rapid single shots. Blue-white bolts smacked into the yellow M above him and blasted it apart. Fuck. John scrabbled to get out and managed to clear the hole a split second before the M crashed down onto where he'd been a moment before. John knew if he'd been a second later, it would have landed on his head and crushed his skull. With the loss of his fire, the machine turned its attention to Ellison's position, his machine gun prioritized as the biggest threat so far. The former agent poured more fire into it and remained the picture of calm even as plasma rounds zipped around him. He clutched the weapon to his shoulder and fired longer bursts of fire that tore into the metal and forced it a step backward, but it recovered its footing and advanced despite the pounding Ellison gave it. He grit his teeth and flattened himself to the ground as much as he could and carried on firing. It was focused on him, he thought, so it would be distracted from the others. A plasma round struck the wall above him, and white-hot flecks of rock and concrete peppered his back. He felt his clothes and skin singed by the sheer heat of the plasma and felt the back of his neck start to blister. That was too close. The machine carried on firing, its shots getting dangerously close to the mark. "Ellison," Savannah cried out, deathly afraid for her guardian as the machine got closer to him. She dropped her rifle and shouldered the M32. "Hey, tin can!" she screamed out and fired a single grenade. The round fell just short of the machine and exploded outwards with a resounding boom that knocked the machine off its feet. It still clung onto its rifle and started to get back to his feet as Savannah took aim once more. "No," John shouted out, too late. Savannah fired 4 more grenades at the machine and all struck the 888 square in the upper chest and the head, exploding in a bright flash that threw it backwards several feet. "Cease fire," John shouted out. A split second later, Ellison's own machine gun fire stopped, and John rushed forward into the open towards the machine. He didn't need to tell Ellison and Savannah to cover him. He knew they were already doing so. There wasn't much left of the Terminator after Savannah's triple grenade blast. A single arm remained, hanging by strands of metal and wire, the upper right chest, The right arm and the head were in pieces all around. "No good," John called out to them in dismay. They couldn't even salvage the plasma rifle. He turned back and moved towards them as they started to collect their gear and get ready to move out. John went back to his now obliterated hiding spot and dug out his pack. It didn't seem damaged. That was something at least, he thought. Savannah passed the machine and knelt down a few yards to its left. She dug through the scraps of metal and concrete and pulled out 3 blocks of Semtex, tied together and connected to a remote detonator. She disassembled the IED and placed it back into her pack. "That went well," she sarcastically muttered, then turned back and spat on the remains of the machine. She pulled out some grenades from her bandolier and started to reload the M32. John wanted to snap at her, tell her not to be so trigger-happy, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. He was just disappointed that it hadn't gone right the first time around. He breathed in deeply and forced himself to calm down. It wasn't her fault. He reminded himself that they'd been together alone for 18 years. After all she'd been through, he could tell Ellison was like a father to her. It wasn't surprising that, given her nature, she'd be more than a little trigger-happy when it came to looking after the man who'd taken care of her since before the war had even started. "What next?" Ellison asked. Savannah went straight to him, and John could see her eyes checking him over for injuries. "You okay?" She asked him. "Yeah," he nodded to her. He saw the relief on her face, the ever so slight relaxing of her features and the exhalation. He reached back and rubbed the irritation on his neck. Heat rash, he thought, from the near miss with the Terminator's plasma shots. Instantly, Savannah pulled him down to his knees, pushed his head forward and looked down at the red raw skin and ugly white blisters that had already started to fill with fluid and swell up. One of the plasma bolts must have missed him by inches, she thought. She sighed and shook her head, then looked across to John. "We need to dress them," she said. "You got the med gear your mom supplied." John nodded but made no move to take off his pack. "We gotta get out of here first. Machines would have heard the noise and they'll be here any minute." He was certain that Cameron would still have a UCAV flying overhead, but he still didn't want to risk it. "We treat it now," Savannah insisted. "I'll be fine," Ellison said amicably. "It's just a burn." John agreed with him. It wasn't as if he'd been hit or anything. "And what happens if they pop while we're moving, or crap gets in there before I can dress it?" Savannah demanded. The chances of it happening were minimal, but she wasn't going to take any risks. John could imagine what would happen. In the less than sanitary conditions of this world, it could easily get infected. Even with the antibiotics his mom supplied, which were years old, and their effect likely diminished, an infection could easily kill a man. He'd seen it plenty of times in South America when he was a kid. He took off his pack and pulled out a sealed wound dressing and tossed it to Savannah. She ripped it open as John stood to with his rifle and pulled the back off of it. Ellison winced in pain as she placed it against the back of his neck and ran her fingers over the adhesive edges, sealing it over the burn. John marveled at how gentle she seemed to be as she treated Ellison. The fact she'd insisted on taking care of his burn, even when they were out in the open, just didn't sit right with the hard-as-nails girl who'd have given his mom a run for her money. Savannah stuffed the empty packaging into her pocket, careful to leave nothing behind, and shouldered her weapon once more, as did Ellison. "Now we can go," she announced. John nodded without a word and took point, leading them away from the scene and quick marching, putting as much distance between themselves and the blasted remains of the metal as they could. They only had a few more hours before first light, and they needed to find a likely spot to encounter a Terminator and set up an ambush point before then. John just hoped they'd be luckier the second time around.